Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the host and creator of Dead Sleep, and if you're new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is the podcast you go to when you've run out of Dateline episodes with Keith Morrison. Anyway, if you're new to Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for nighttime, for uninterrupted nighttime listening. The stories that are real-life mysteries told more mindfully, gripping and never graphic. Tonight's story is a continuation of a saga that we started in the previous episode called Twisted Fate. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the previous episode, that's okay. We'll do a little recap, get you up to speed, and you can always go back and listen to the previous episode right after this. This episode's a little longer and more dense than previous episodes, but let's see how you like it. Let's see how it goes. So with that, let's settle in for the night. Get cozy under those covers. Let's close our eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's some of the most beautiful land in all of California. No wonder they named it Pleasant Valley. The vast area of Central California all around Pleasant Valley is known for a few things. For growing food, including California's most valuable agricultural export, almonds. The rural area of Pleasant Valley is one of the safest and most affordable places to raise a family in a very expensive state. And then, Pleasant Valley is known for something less pleasant. The Pleasant Valley State Prison, known for housing at one point or another some of the most high-profile inmates in modern American history. Names any true crime follower would know. A rogues gallery of men in true crime lore whose stories have been told and retold in documentaries, dramatizations, and podcasts. There was Saran, who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. There's the Menendez brothers, convicted in 1996 for the murder of their parents, Kitty and Jose. And more recently, Paul Flores, who was convicted in 2023 for the 1996 murder of college student Kristen Smart. When a best-selling author named Sarah Gruen came to the Pleasant Valley State Prison in November of 2015, she was there to see another man inside that prison. A convicted killer with a name nobody knew. Sarah was determined that one day soon, everybody would know his name. Charles Murdoch. And she was determined that everybody would also know that her new friend Charles, Chuck, was innocent. Because Sarah was certain that he was wrongfully convicted of first-degree murder in an armed robbery of a local bar in Long Beach that ended with the fatal shooting of a bar patron named Robert Nenteas. This was a murder case that spanned decades, beginning with the incident at the bar that happened back in 1983, when three men walked into a bar in Long Beach, California, and took everything in a cash register. Just $200. They ended up wounding one of the bar patrons with a knife and then fatally shooting another customer. That's Robert Nenteas. There were allegedly 4 suspects, and the case went cold for over a decade, until 2 of the suspects, that was Chuck and a man named Dino DiNardo, were apprehended, tried, and convicted in the mid-1990s. At his trial, Chuck was depicted as the ringleader, the guy holding the gun who killed a man in cold blood with what they described as a reckless indifference to human life. Now, 20 years later, Chuck was pushing 60, and he'd spent the last 2 decades declaring his innocence, filing court documents, enduring rejection, hoping, maybe finally after years of bad luck, he might have some good luck. And finally, he found it. With his good luck charm, it seemed. Sarah Gruen. You might remember from the previous episode called Twisted Fate that in the spring of 2015, Sarah, a famous author, had received a fan letter from Chuck Murdoch. She had received letters from incarcerated people before, and while flattered, never thought about writing any of them back. But something about Chuck, she was drawn to him and his case. And the more she got to know Chuck, the more she looked into his case, the more convinced she became that she and her husband Bob could help. Sarah had a couple of things that Chuck didn't have. She had resources. Sarah was a best-selling author with plenty of money in the bank, and she had fame. And those are two things that go a long way in the United States. Because Sarah enjoyed the kind of profile that could capture people's attention. And with enough financial resources and enough attention brought to this case, Sarah and her husband Bob believed they could successfully find a way to get Chuck out of prison. As her husband Bob put it, "We naively thought that with Sarah having a public image, we could just push it and tell people about it, and someone would clear it up." But it became obvious that wasn't true. Who could blame her for believing that with enough money and enough attention, the truth could set a man free? This was the era of serial fever. A year earlier in 2014, the podcast Serial debuted, and the groundbreaking reinvestigation of the murder conviction of Adnan Syed sparked a whole new era of true crime, where we weren't just passive consumers of the genre. We were active participants in the criminal justice system. And for millions of people, that show offered a stunning and stark awareness that there were people, perhaps a lot of people, who were behind bars, convicted for crimes they hadn't committed. Then in 2015, around the same time Sarah was deep into Chuck's case, came Making a Murderer, a fascinating and controversial true crime documentary series that followed a similar narrative as Chuck's case. It was about an unsavory character named Stephen Avery, who was framed for the murder of a young woman. He was the victim of a corrupt system. At least that's the story told in the documentary. There were people who were so upset about Stephen Avery being behind bars for a crime that he potentially didn't commit that thousands of people signed a petition for President Obama to pardon Stephen Avery, which President Obama had to gently explain that was something he just couldn't do. It was not his jurisdiction. Whatever was happening around the time that Sarah became aware of Chuck's case, this was an era that was more than true crime. It was a hybrid, true crime and criminal justice. It was mission-driven advocacy that also made for captivating entertainment. Sarah and Bob recognized they weren't legal experts, so they hired a criminal attorney based in California, and were under the impression that for around $80,000 in legal fees, they'd have this all wrapped up and Chuck out of prison by April of 2016. This lawyer and his team were tasked with finding something new evidence or witness testimony, something that would open the door to a new trial, perhaps. Or maybe something that would even secure Chuck a full exoneration. By the time Sarah went to the prison to visit Chuck in person, they were almost enthralled with each other, that this was all a matter of fate. When she wrote to Chuck, she talked about what life was going to be like for him on the outside. And in their correspondence, you get the impression that she saw herself as his guardian angel, or at the very least, his handler, and that when he got out of prison, she would take extra care of him, which included vetting every single person that wanted to be in Chuck's life. Sarah hoped that when Chuck was released from prison, she could help him rebuild his life. "I think the enormity of what you've been through will hit you, and it may feel like more than you could manage, she wrote to him. But as the days, then months, ticked by, Sarah's friends began to worry if this was all too much for Sarah herself to manage. This included one of her closest friends, a journalist named Abbott Kahler, who wrote about what happened to Sarah in New York Magazine. She was worried about Sarah because, well, Sarah had thrown herself into this case completely, and it appeared that she'd let her life, her real life, go. She was months behind on her book, and this case had drained Sarah of her energy and her finances. By 2016, Sarah had fired the first lawyer that they brought in, and they were now working with another team. And the lawyer's fees were $20,000 a month. They'd blown way past that $80,000 fee and were now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so far, they were no closer to getting justice for Chuck. Chuck was, after all, LWOP, life without parole. A life sentence can mean different things in different states, but in the state of California, that meant life without parole was absolute. It wasn't the death penalty, but it was acknowledging a death sentence. He'd be there until the day he died. The pathway to freedom for someone like Chuck was limited. No matter how good his behavior was, how many years passed, he'd never be out of prison. He'd never be on parole. The origin of the word parole comes from Old French, dating back to the 1600s. And parole means word, as in giving your word. And that notion of parole, that someone could be released from prison and honor their word, that they'd changed and that they wouldn't repeat the same mistakes, was widely applied in criminal sentencing until the mid-1990s, right around the time Chuck was going to trial, when two high-profile incidences occurred in California. The first was the murder of 18-year-old Kimber Reynolds, who was shot to death while fighting off two men who were trying to steal her purse. The second, infamous case was the kidnapping and murder of 13-year-old Polly Klaas in Northern California. In both of those devastating cases, the perpetrators were repeat offenders, dangerous career criminals who'd been in and out of prison and should never have been allowed back out on the streets. Those two cases, and the outspoken family members of the victims, led to the passage of the Three Strikes Law. The Three Strikes Law took a baseball metaphor and applied it to severe criminal sentencing. You get 3 strikes. That's 3 convictions. And then you're out, which actually means you're in. Automatic life in prison. Back in the 90s, the Three Strikes Law was a ballot initiative, which meant California residents voted on whether 3 strikes should pass. And that initiative did pass. In November of 1994, with an overwhelming majority, 70% of California voters were in favor of 3 strikes. Chuck's case wasn't a 3-strike case, but the severity of Chuck's sentencing, that's life without parole, reflected the tough-on-crime agenda at that time, in an overall push to keep the bad guys off the streets, which is what happened, and it created some problems. From 1977 to 2006, the prison population jumped from fewer than 20,000 inmates to over 166,000 inmates. That's more than double the prison design capacity. According to the LA Times, since 1984, California has spent $6.2 billion building 23 prisons. This included the facility where Chuck was housed, the Pleasant Valley State Prison, which was built in 1994, a year before Chuck's conviction. Again, Chuck swore he had nothing to do with any of it, but the way the court saw it, Chuck was exactly where he should be, behind bars, forever. The head-scratching part of Chuck's conviction, and it was something that I had to check and triple-check when I looked at the court documents. was a curious thing about his sentencing. That back in 1995, when the jury announced their guilty verdict, they noted in their verdict that they believed Chuck was involved with the robbery and played a precipitous role in the murder of Robert Nintes. But they didn't believe Chuck was the actual shooter. Was he complicit? Yes. But he was not the one who fired the gun. But that clarification didn't change the felony murder conviction or the severity of Chuck's sentencing. Now, his accomplice, Dino DiNardo, the one who took the money from the register, his conviction was for voluntary manslaughter, and he ultimately served 5 years of a 12-year sentence. Chuck was different, the court said, because they believed Chuck was the ringleader, the one who organized the whole thing, and was therefore as accountable for the shooting as if he were the one who pulled the trigger himself. It was a phrase I saw a few different times in the court documents, that Chuck displayed a reckless indifference for human life. The 2 other men who were allegedly there that night have never been found and never been charged. But that was 20 years ago. And by 2015, times had changed, attitudes had changed. And right around the time that Sarah offered her help, there was a chance that Chuck's case could be revisited. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, 2015 was a record-breaking year, with at least 149 people who were cleared of committing crimes for which they'd been convicted. More than a third of these cases involved homicides, and 5 resulted in people being freed from death row. And the cause of their wrongful conviction was official misconduct, which included inadequate legal defense, mistaken witness identification, and false accusation, which meant if Chuck was telling the truth, he had at least 2 out of 3. But proving misconduct, that would take more time and more money. 2 things Sarah was running out of. Sarah and Bob had 3 children to provide for, which included the cost of college tuition, so they'd never planned on spending all of their money on Chuck's legal fees. It was a cruel game of hurry up and wait. There was always some urgent need, some new lead, then weeks and months of nothing. By 2016, Sarah and Bob knew they'd gotten in too deep financially. But if they backed out now, it would all be lost. The case against Chuck Murdoch relied entirely on witness testimony. 2 witnesses, the bartender who testified she saw Chuck with the gun that night, and Chuck's alleged accomplice, the man whose fingerprints were found in the coin slots in the cash register. That was the same man who later claimed his confession was coerced and that he was pressured to testify against Chuck. That was Dino DiNardo. If Chuck had any hope, Sarah and her legal team had to track these 2 witnesses and get them to make some kind of official statement, like a signed affidavit, recanting their original witness testimony from the original 1995 trial. With her savings running low, Sarah needed to push harder to ensure Chuck's case generated the kind of exposure that would make Chuck Murdoch a household name, get everyone talking, and get them on Chuck's side. So Sarah made a video. It was a simple but emotional video, and she sent it to Dr. Phil, the tough-talking talk show host. In the 1.5-minute long video, Sarah gave Dr. Phil the shorthand of Chuck's saga, and then made a tearful plea for Dr. Phil's help. Dr. Phil's producer called and said she was intrigued by the video. One of the producer's first questions was a question that Sarah didn't want to answer. Was Sarah in love with Chuck Murdoch? Sarah was furious at this salacious take. Was that all people cared about? Did a woman have to be in love with someone to offer help? It was sexist and unfair. A man helps another man get out of prison. He's a criminal justice activist and hero. A woman does it? She's some pathetic, lonely heart. Sarah told Dr. Phil's producers that she was absolutely, positively not in love with Chuck Murdoch. Sarah was a generous and selfless person, willing to help anyone. There was no romantic interest there, and there never would be. She was happily married. She couldn't help it if Chuck was falling in love with her. Her husband, Bob, saw it happen. Chuck's love for Sarah, and he wasn't surprised. Who wouldn't fall in love with his wife? She was beautiful, kind, with a huge heart and boundless empathy. And she was dedicated to Chuck in a way that seemed a lot like love. Maybe not romantic love for Sarah, but together she and Chuck shared a rare and profound intimacy, one that came from Sarah's desire, her need, to stubbornly do what was right, to come to the rescue of someone in need, a fellow human being. Sarah was a novelist, and in her stories, she could make characters do and say whatever she wanted. But in real life, it was different. But Chuck was a flesh and blood human being who could say and do things that Sarah didn't like, that Sarah couldn't control. And something she couldn't control was how Chuck felt about her, and how he expressed that in his letters. She kept telling Chuck to stop with all the mushy stuff, that this relationship, it wasn't like that. But for a man like Chuck, whose life, whose freedom was in her hands, Sarah was probably everything. A beautiful woman, a best friend, his most loyal ally, and, it seemed, his liberator. His one and only shot at freedom. In his letters to her, he called her loving pet names like Sarah Rue, and he clarified his own nickname, Badfish. Badfish was the name he added to the bottom of his letters, usually with a drawing of a brightly colored fish like something out of Finding Nemo. The name Badfish sounded like some dark criminal alter ego. But it turned out it was the name of his fantasy self, this beach bum guy who surfed all day back home in Southern California. Badfish was his name in a different life, a free life, one that he might finally be able to live, thanks to Sarah Gruen. As I was putting this episode together, I was curious about this reference, this name, Badfish, and where it came from. And it turns out there's actually a song called Badfish, and it's by a band called Sublime, a ska reggae rock band from Long Beach, Chuck's hometown. Sublime had a lot of hits in the 90s, but I'd never heard this particular song, which probably says more about me because it has like 200 million listens on Spotify. I won't sing it for you. It's got a grunge Dr. Seuss quality, and the lyrics, in part, go like this. When you grab a hold of me, you tell me that I'll never be set free. But I'm a parasite. Creep and crawl as I step into the night. 2 pints of booze. Tell me, are you a bad fish too? Apparently, this song Badfish is about heroin addiction. And a bad fish is a heroin addict who gets someone else hooked on heroin. And the lead singer of the band struggled with heroin addiction, and he died in 1996 from an overdose. That was just before the band broke and became big. And as I listened to it, probably overthinking, of course, but there was an addictive quality to the dynamic between Sarah and Chuck. And in this case, which one was the bad fish? Was it Chuck, who lured Sarah into his case? Or was it Sarah, who'd gotten Chuck hooked on the hope that one day she would be the one to set him free? In the summer of 2016, there was finally some promising news. a television production company was interested in making a reality TV series about Chuck and his case, and how Sarah and Bob, but mostly Sarah, were dedicated to Chuck in his exoneration and release. This could be the next Making a Murderer, or more accurately, Unmaking a Murderer. With a docuseries like this, everyone would know who Chuck was, and that exposure would propel renewed interest in the case and potentially lead to fresh evidence or witnesses that would be the thing they needed. Also, the TV production company agreed to cover the legal costs, the costs that had already drained Sarah and Bob's nest egg. But a TV deal was yet another thing that took time to pull together, which left Sarah and Bob still footing the legal bills. By the fall of 2016, Sarah revealed to friends that she was virtually broke, or as she put it, officially poor. Not out on the street poor, but no more vacations, and she'd have to start clipping coupons. At one point, she and Bob borrowed against their own home in Asheville, North Carolina. But the trade-off, Sarah said, was worth it. She would have saved a man's life. And then around Thanksgiving of 2016, Sarah noticed a relative, a young girl, obsessed with a new toy. The toy was called Hatchimal. Hatchimals were these plastic eggs that once you added water to the egg cracked and revealed a cute little creature inside. Sarah sensed these toys were going to be in huge demand for Christmas, like the Beanie Babies or Cabbage Patch Dolls of 2016. So she hatched an inventive scheme. To raise cash for Chuck's legal fees, she'd buy up a bunch of Hatchimals and resell them on eBay for a few bucks more, and make a nice little dividend that would go straight into Chuck's legal fund. Just after Thanksgiving, Sarah went online, and what was described as a 4-day bidding frenzy, she scooped up around 150 Hatchimal toys and spent just over $23,000. She joked with a friend that she couldn't decide if she had big balls or no brains. But the internet didn't find Sarah's buying spree very funny. Word soon got out that a best-selling author named Sarah Gruen was hoarding a bunch of Hatchimals, jacking up the price, and basically screwing everyone else out of Christmas. I have a friend with a special needs child, and all he wanted was a Hatchimal, but they're sold out, said one commenter. People like Sarah Gruen make me sick. As the story of Sarah the Greedy Toy Grinch circulated online and made news headlines, the internet unleashed its rage on Sarah, and it was like nothing she'd ever experienced before. She was flooded with insults, physical threats, even death threats. Her haters stalled the sales of her Hatchimals by creating fake accounts where they ordered up all the toys, then canceled their orders at the very last second. You might recall from the previous episode that Sarah was already uncomfortable with fame and attention. But this hateful notoriety, shared amongst thousands and thousands of people who said that she should be locked up, that people wanted her to die, it was her worst nightmare. And the more she tried to explain herself, that this was for a good cause, that she was trying to help free a man from prison, the more she sounded like she was running some sick scam. In the end, she managed to sell the Hatchimals, but only made $6,000. That was not even close to covering these legal costs, which were now hovering at around $500,000. And these threats to Sarah's life, well, things were about to get worse. Still reeling and rattled from the whole Hatchimals hoarding disaster, Sarah received a DM from a strange man on Twitter. It was a baffling and convoluted story, but the gist of it was Sarah's relationship with Chuck had come to the attention of some of Chuck's enemies, including a man that Chuck allegedly stabbed with a prison shank during some kind of dust-up, one that Chuck vehemently denied. Anyway, apparently the guy that was stabbed had connections to the Aryan Brotherhood, a neo-Nazi prison gang. The Aryan Brotherhood had an estimated 20,000 members on the inside and outside of prison walls. And the Aryan Brotherhood controls the majority of white inmates in all of California prisons, including the Pleasant Valley State Prison. What they wanted from Sarah, she didn't know. But it appeared they took issue with her helping Chuck, which Sarah interpreted as a threat. She was already fearful and paranoid about the angry Hatchimals mob, and now she was the potential target of a violent criminal gang of neo-Nazis. Sarah became so fearful of what was going to happen to her and to her family, she fled her own home. She knew they had her address, and she began living in hotels, one hotel after another, sometimes traveling over 500 miles to ensure her family's safety. She started wearing disguises, wigs and sunglasses, so she wouldn't be recognized. She bought a BB gun that looked like a real pistol. All of Sarah's life, she dedicated to rescuing animals and ensuring their safety. Then, with all of this, it flipped. Now she needed the protection and bought a special breed of guard dog, one that could attack, even kill, anyone who wanted to hurt her, like, say, a neo-Nazi assassin. She told the lawyers working on Chuck's case that she was probably being paranoid, but she couldn't keep her mind from going into a bad place. She told her friends if she went missing, to alert her family in Canada. And while all of this was happening, there was someone who was really important to Chuck's case, who was genuinely missing. Dino DiNardo. You'll remember that Dino DiNardo was the prosecution's key witness, the one who testified against Chuck in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. Though, you'll remember, at one point, Dino recanted his confession and said Chuck was innocent in some letter to his lawyer. But in the end, that letter was considered attorney-client privilege, and it didn't do anything to help Chuck's case. Dino should have been released from prison in 1999. Maybe he would help support Chuck in his case. Dino still had family in Long Beach, but efforts to track him down had proven fruitless, which meant there was only one other witness, the bartender who was working that night, a woman who said she saw Chuck with the gun that night back in 1983. And finally, in March of 2017, the team's investigator finally tracked her down. Decades later, the question was, would this woman have a different story? Was there something else she could reveal? Something that might help Chuck's case? The address that the investigator found for this woman turned out to be a psychiatric hospital in Tucson, Arizona. The investigator spoke to the woman for hours and learned she'd been diagnosed with bipolar psychosis and schizoaffective disorder. There was no way this woman would be considered a credible witness in any trial. And not much help with this renewed investigation either, which was maybe for the best, because the one thing the woman did say, some 34 years after the robbery and murder, was that she was 100% certain the man with the gun was Charles Murdoch. And she said she was still haunted by his eyes. Back in the Pleasant Valley State Prison, Chuck was himself haunted by a menacing new pen pal who'd taken to sending Chuck threatening letters in the mail. One of the letters read, "Dear Bad Luck Chuck, we set your golden goose free. And you want to know why? Because water is for elephants, not lame bitches like you. Get comfy. You're going to be there for a while. Hugs and kisses, Dino DiNardo and the man with the keys to the bee yard." When Sarah learned of the letter, she was more terrified than ever. She was the golden goose. Was this yet another threat to her life? Her relationship with Chuck was also in jeopardy. She'd made it clear for years now that there was no romantic connection, but Chuck continued to do things, make overtures, gestures that felt inappropriate. When Sarah learned that Chuck had her name tattooed on his hand, she'd finally had it. She was mortified, horrified, embarrassed, cringing. If the media saw it, she knew they would consider it confirmation of their theory that Sarah was cheating on Bob and using their combined resources to free her prison lover. And if they saw that tattoo, she didn't even know what she was going to do. She told her friend that her mental illness number just shot off the top of the barometer. The stress of it all was becoming unbearable. She was constantly running from place to place, her physical mental health hanging by a thread, and her career on the precipice of collapse. She was months, maybe years, late with her novel, the historical fiction about the Orient Express, and she begged her agent more than once for an extension. Yet, when it came time to write, she couldn't function. And then, one day, she lost her mind. On Christmas Day in 2017, she was with her family. They'd opened presents, had a festive day, yet Sarah, who'd already had crushing headaches, couldn't remember anything. It was as if she'd blacked out for hours that Christmas Day and couldn't recall a single moment, or a gift, or conversation. She soon discovered she had an episode of a condition called transient global amnesia, which, according to the Mayo Clinic, means a person is unable to create new memory, so the memory of recent events disappears. You can't remember where you are or how you got there. You may not remember anything about what's happening right now. You may keep repeating the same questions because you don't remember the answers you've just been given. You may also draw a blank when asked to remember things that happened a day, a month, or even a year ago. Episodes of transient global amnesia always get better slowly over a few hours. During recovery, you may begin to remember events and circumstances. On the Mayo Clinic's website, it says this condition isn't serious, but it sure felt that way to Sarah. Sarah was the only one who knew everything about Chuck's case, who had studied 10,000 pages of transcripts and put together a 50-page dossier explaining it to legal authorities. It was as if maybe she wanted to forget she'd ever gotten involved with this case, forget that Chuck existed, which would have meant destroying everything, of walking away, pretending like it never happened. Because Sarah was guilty of the inverse of what Chuck was convicted of. Hers was not reckless indifference. Hers was a recklessness of caring too much, doing too much, to the point of self-destruction, and even harming Chuck's case. When the article about Chuck and Sarah was published back in 2021, the headline of the article read, "How Sarah Gruen Lost Her Life. The Water for Elephants author's 6-year fight to free an incarcerated man left her absolutely broke and critically ill." And a lot of people, this includes me, interpreted her story like a cautionary tale about a rich woman with a savior complex. And it was a little condescending, like the little lady had gotten in over her head. And over the years, I've thought a lot about this story and how her efforts were hindered, or at least people were distracted by the titillating possibility of a forbidden romance between Sarah and Chuck. And that distraction includes Chuck, I think. And as I was working on this story and my fascination with it, I tried to think about where things went wrong. And I remember what Bob said about their plan from the very beginning, that if they gave this case enough exposure, and they used Sarah's fame to push it in front of people, someone would come along and take care of it. like a modern-day deus ex machina, a god in the machine who'd come down and fix everything, which would turn this bedtime story from a true crime saga into a Greek tragedy. So where was Chuck throughout all of this? And what happened between them in the end? That's a good question, because we only really got Sarah's side of the story in the article. Sarah and Chuck's story gained a lot of attention, and it wasn't necessarily the kind of attention that Sarah or Chuck wanted. And it being the internet, the hot takes were mostly fiery indictments of how Sarah mishandled $500,000. And people had a lot of ideas about how that money should have been spent. Maybe they're right, that it could have gone to a nonprofit, an innocence project, and helped scores of people, not just failed to help one man. You'll remember from a previous episode, it cost a billionaire $35 million to get justice over a single bottle of bad wine. The cost of justice is boundless. For those of us who've harbored fantasies about fighting injustice if we only had the money and the time and the fame, but there's never enough money. There's never enough fame. And there's rarely enough time. Chuck is now close to 70. And as far as I know, he's still in prison. Sarah lives in North Carolina with her husband, and her book, Water for Elephants, is now a hit Broadway musical, which bodes well for her future and her finances. And for what it's worth, Chuck has since moved on in a different way. He moved from the Pleasant Valley State Prison to another facility. He moved on with a new legal team. And while Sarah's writing suffered from this experience, Chuck, it appears he was inspired to write a memoir, where he'll tell his own life story for the first time from his side of things. Whether it has Sarah in it, I don't know. But there is a chapter called Topanga Reverie, likely a reference to Topanga Canyon, which is near Malibu, a place where you can see the Pacific Ocean into infinity. On the cover of the book, at least the thumbnail I saw online, is a drawing, likely Chuck's drawing, of a brightly colored striped fish, that alter ego, Badfish. Not some bad guy, but the imaginary surfer dude Chuck apparently dreams of being. And in this version of his life, maybe he's the bad fish that didn't get caught. The one who's out there somewhere in the watery expanse of the Pacific Ocean. And maybe in this version of his story, he's finally, maybe for the first time in his life, swimming with and not against the tide. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. As always, this is the bedtime version of a real-life story. So if you want to know the full story of this case, check out the links in the show notes. And if you're still awake, I want to share what's on deck for subscribers this May. I'll be releasing 2 bonus episodes for paid subscribers, and one of them is kicking off a series I'm calling Forensic Files Fridays, where I'll be retelling an old episode of Forensic Files as a dreamy dead sleep bedtime story. Forensic Files was the show, or at least one of the shows, that got me hooked on falling asleep to true crime years ago. So I'm excited to transform those vintage true crime tales into something special and sleepy for subscribers this month in May. I'll be back next week with an all-new true crime saga to fall asleep to. So follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.